Yeah, it's not. It's okay. Okay, we are live. If it's your first time here, this is Language Learning Lives, a series of interviews with researchers who are somehow interested in uh, learners and teachers' lives. And today here we have Dr. Garold Murray. Hello, how are you, Dr. Garold?
I'm, I'm good, thank you. Fine.
So, how are things in Japan?
Oh, well, I think the thing about Japan is nobody really knows. The news is that the prime minister is declaring a state of emergency for prefectures that in the Tokyo area. So that's so I don't know. Like some businesses will be closed, but some will be open. I don't think anybody really knows how that's going to play out in the next 24 hours, but we'll see. But I'm good. I mean, and people I know are well, so far so good.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I
Yeah.
hope you keep safe. So let me
Me too.
just introduce Dr. Murray here. So Garold Murray holds a PhD in language education from the University of British Columbia, Canada, and he has worked with ESL and EFL learners in junior high school, undergraduate, and graduate programs, and language teachers in both pre-service and in-service contexts. In the area of out-of-class learning, he established and managed two self-access centers in Japan, one of which was open to the general public. His research interests focus on learner autonomy, social learning spaces, narrative inquiry, and complexity. And today we're going to talk about some uh, things that he's expert and uh, see some of his insights on the situation that we are uh, living now. Okay, so Dr. Murray, in an article from 2017, you mentioned that learner autonomy is a concept in motion. And there you remind us that the concept was introduced in the late 1970s and has demonstrated its capability, its capacity to adapt to changing times. So could you briefly draw a timeline highlighting how the notion of autonomy has changed over the years?
Okay. Well, yeah, as you pointed out, autonomy was introduced. Everybody mostly is in agreement on this. It was introduced in the late 1970s in a document that was prepared for the Council of Europe. And it was defined as the ability to take charge of one's learning. Now, the thing about a timeline is it suggests a linear progression,
Yeah.
and it also suggests it has implications of or connotations of progress. And I'm not sure that learner autonomy doesn't fit well into a timeline
Okay.
because its development as a concept was it was more like a network or a web. And by that, I mean that people in different parts of the world were working on surprisingly similar ideas at the same time. And maybe they had contact, maybe they didn't. But they were also working on different aspects of learner autonomy. So, having said that, I'm going to try to put some things into a timeline for you, some concepts. I've jotted down some notes here with some dates. And so let's go back to 79 when that document first came out. And it's most often cited today, I think, as an Oxford book, 1981. And then 10 years later, like at the beginning of the 1990s, the notion of interdependence had entered into the conversation of learner autonomy. And I don't think it's and so this sort of sowed the seeds for the notion of autonomy as a social construct. And I don't think it's any well, not a coincidence or accident, but around the mid 90s at the ILA conference, Firth and Wagner were presenting their paper on which launched the idea of applied linguistics, like the social turn in applied linguistics. So these ideas, I think, were sort of, floating around and being dealt with in general. Then around the year 2000, the focus shifted to autonomy, the notion of control. Like autonomy became defined as the capacity to control one's own learning. Okay, and the these years, the first decade of the 21st century, I think was a boom time for learner autonomy because there was a lot of things written, conferences were being held, and there were so many ideas that were coming out. For example, autonomy was being looked at as in terms of personal development, in terms of social responsibility, uh, these kinds of things, different manifestations of learner autonomy. And then a real turning point for me was ILA 2008 in Essen. I went to a symposium on complexity. Now, this symposium highlighted the work of your colleagues in Brazil, and it looked at various themes, for example, identity and complexity in language learning. But for me, what I walked away with was the symposium was about autonomy and complexity in language learning. So that was a turning point for me. Another turning point, I think, in that first decade was the year 2003, when a group of Kiwis got together and organized a conference in Melbourne, Australia. And this was the first independent learning conference. And what this did, it provided people all over the world an opportunity to come together, to share their ideas, to share their research. And so this it's interesting because the Independent Learning Association, which sort of grew out of this conference, does not exist. There's no such thing as an independent learning association. There's no executive, there's no membership, there's no constitution or dues to pay. But every 2 or 3 years, it arises out of the ethers and people gather and there's a conference. So I think, yeah. And there was supposed to be one in Mexico now at the end of June, early July. I don't know if that's going to happen because of the situation in the world. I haven't heard. But anyway, my point is that all these things were happening in this first decade of the century. And then more recently, in applied linguistics, people have started to focus on notions of space and place. For example, some people have taken Bakhtín's notion of the chronotope and they're using that to help them have a better grasp on what we mean by context and that kind of thing. People are exploring human geography, the theories of space and place, and some people linguistic landscapes. Mm-hmm. So and like in my case, for example, I was very interested in self-access learning, and now my focus has switched to social learning spaces and the idea of how spaces are transformed into places. But what's really interesting is that I suppose this year, or maybe last year, marks the 50th anniversary of the date that autonomy was introduced into language learning. And when it was introduced, like it could have been seen as a very sort of unidimensional concept because it focused on the individual learner, okay? Mm-hmm. But now, 50 years later, it's this complex, multidimensional phenomena.
Yeah.
You know?
And this notion, you mentioned that some researchers see autonomy regarded as the individual's learner's control over their own learning process inside and outside the classroom. Do you share this thought? What's your opinion about this definition of autonomy being something related to control?
Well, I have to say, I was looking for the questions you sent me because when I read that question, you said, do you share this idea? Why not? And I thought, oh my God, he's answered the question for me. It's provided the answer in the question. And then I began to think, well, I wonder what I've said or what I've written to give him the impression that the answer would be no. The thing about control is clearly an issue when it comes to learner autonomy. If you're a student sitting in a classroom where the teacher has total control, there's no space for learner autonomy, okay? If you're a teacher working in an institution where the administration has laid out the curriculum, and you're teaching to a common exam, for example, or the whole point is for the students to raise their TOEIC score.
Mhm.
That's what you're teaching to, and that does happen at universities in Japan. I don't know about elsewhere in the world because let's face it, neoliberalism, accountability, numbers, you know. So anyway, if that's the case, you have no teacher autonomy, and guess what? There's no student autonomy either. Okay, so there's autonomy. Control enters into it on different levels. Okay, and I think it's important to recognize that. Then there's the level of the individual learner inside their head. What about control there? Do we have control over our cognitive processes? There's this big debate right now amongst neuroscientists that we do or we don't. Okay, if you when you finish here, if you go on the BBC website, they have a whole series of interviews with neuroscientists on this very debate. And the idea is that there's no ghost in the machine. We don't have control. We have the illusion of control. Okay, so there's all of this going on. Me, I like the idea that of autonomy as being as having learners take as learners take responsibility for their learning. Okay, and that we as teachers, our role is to help learners, to enable them, to support them, to encourage them to take responsibility for their learning. And even then, neuroscientists come back at us and they say, well, there's no mechanism in the brain for responsibility. It's a social thing. You only have responsibility in the interaction between more than one brain. And it's the same with control. So in other words, control and responsibility are emergent phenomena. So to sort of sum up all of this, to bring it back to your question, I tend towards Vera Menezes' understanding of learner autonomy, that it's a socio-cognitive system, okay? And what we understand is control and what we see as control, it's just one of the elements that's operating with one of the emergent elements operating within this system.
Yeah, that's why I asked you this question, because I was wondering to see your point of view of those interrelation of this interrelation with other notions.
Yeah, control is problematic and it's complex. It's not as simple. And I think one of the problems is that I think autonomy is terribly misunderstood in the world in general. I think there are very few people that really understand what those of us who are into learner autonomy are all about, or what we're trying to say. I think there's an element of fear there to a certain extent. I mean, let's face it, teaching is big business. It's people, these universities now are, they're sending people out all over the world to offer courses, kind of thing. So it's big business, textbooks, all of that. So if you have people running around learning on their own, that could put a dent in your wallet, kind of thing. So I think there's that aspect. But I think the whole thing about control, I think people latched onto that and really just misunderstood it. Because when I was growing up, when I was doing my teacher training, when I was in my early years as a teacher, the big thing was you had to control your class. A teacher couldn't control their class, they were no good. Okay. And then as I got involved in teacher training, like several years later, the conversation had shifted to classroom management, which is a much nicer and probably more humane way of going about it, dealing with people. But my point is that, yeah, control, yeah, it's an issue and it's problematic. But I think so. I think the thing is when people in autonomy started saying, well, it's about learners taking control. I mean, people immediately thought of anarchy in the classroom. They had all these visions of chaos and
Yeah,
the students running the teacher out of the room kind of thing.
and those beliefs are very problematic because, uh, at least in Brazil, teachers are when they get a job, they are told that they have to control the classroom. And so, how can a controlled teacher who controls his or her students foster an autonomy environment? So uh, that's an issue.
It is an issue, and I think one of the things Davis, again, in the first decade of the century, Davis and Samara, two Canadians, they were actually at UBC when I was there. They anyway, neither here nor there, but they were exploring pedagogy in terms of complex and research in education in terms of complexity. And one of the things that they talked about was distributed control. Okay, that is sort of a decentralized control, a shared control. Like control is going to be present in different manifestations, in different forms, in any situation, even amongst two friends. I mean, there's always the possibility that one, maybe not even in a negative sense of manipulation, but control is present. Okay, so I think I think this is one thing that the teachers can do. They can implement this distributed control, and they can distribute control very simply by. I mean, autonomy has been very much related with choice, giving learners choices, implementing, including them in decisions, kind of thing, having discussions about um, different aspects of procedures, perhaps, or what would you like to do in this context? There's tons. So control can be distributed, I think, in the classroom. And one of the things that I did, and it took me a long time to come to this conclusion. A lot of attention has been paid to group work in language education. Okay, project, group work, that kind of thing. And one of the things that I did was I divided the class into teams. And different members took turns being team leader. And the team leader was really responsible for the others in the sense that made sure they were included, that that they had their say and that kind of thing. And in Japan, students are very reticent to raise their hand and ask a question or anything like that. So I said, okay, it's the group leader. That's their job. You discuss whatever it is, and then the group leader, I'll come and we'll talk. Okay. So that took a lot of pressure off people who were reticent, but it distributed the control. It gave them a say, sort of. So that's just one possibility. But I mean, what I'm trying to say is there are ways to do this, I think, even if you're in and still not have anarchy or chaos in the classroom kind of thing. And of course, with project work, that's another thing. Like kids can be doing all kinds of different stuff. And I think Lenny Dam, like her work, her book 1995, where she talks about how she went about having or promoting learner autonomy in her, I think, junior high level classrooms in Denmark. I think that's a classic if you're interested in how to go about implementing control in the school system, or control or autonomy rather.
Yeah, because I've been in touch with my friends in Brazil, and lots of them have kids in schools, and the kids are studying at home now. So one of the big complaints is that the students uh, are asked to be autonomous, but right now, since teachers don't really know what they're doing, it's kind of everything kind of new to them. They simply send the tasks, and the students are feel like overwhelmed with the amount of things to do. So, so in this way, the notion of autonomy is somehow uh, misleading, or I mean misunderstood, as you mentioned before.
That's the big problem. And, I'm jumping ahead. Like one of your questions further down the line was, what recommendations would I have for teacher educators? And, since you brought it up, we're in an unprecedented crisis in terms of education. Forget about the people dying in the hospital. That's a whole other matter. Yeah. Okay. Forget about the fact that the economy shut down and all of this. Like in your home, you have kids that need schooling. Okay. And the teachers are sending this stuff. What I see as the problem is, I'm basing myself on a few people that I've talked to here in Japan, teachers and professors who are responsible for teachers and getting the curriculum out and getting things organized. Okay, sort of they're not administrators, but they've been given these responsibilities kind of things in their department. And the big problem is nobody's prepared for this. Yeah. Nobody has training in distance education. Distance education is a field of study. Okay, nobody has training in how to prepare online classes. What about the pedagogy? What form should they take? How do you evaluate? And one of the big things is, what do we get the kids to do? What about content? Okay, now, and then this whole idea of accountability. To summarize, what I'm saying is nobody's prepared for this. Yeah. And, so people are just going to have to do the best they can. And the people that I know of are out there doing their best to put something together valuable in terms of content and to help teachers who have no experience to be able to do the online classes and that kind of thing. But, it's putting an awful lot of strain on people. And if you stop and think about it, teachers must be terribly stressed because this is their professional life. What they know is being in a classroom with a group of kids, whatever the age level is, whether it's 6 or 16 or 26 kind of thing, And what they're not accustomed to is, what we're doing now, sitting in front of a computer and communicating with their class. Or be able to prepare material. Anyway, it's just a whole nightmare. It's a whole nightmare. So in the future, I think this is a wake-up call for people who are in teacher education. I think it's a wake-up call for administrators. What we need to do, we need programs that train people to deliver online courses. But first and foremost, as you pointed out, we need courses in programs that provide people with the basics of learner autonomy. What is learner autonomy? And all its aspects, self-directed learning. How can people learn how to learn on their own kind of thing? But in this case, and that's been another problem with learner autonomy, this whole idea of learning on your own. David Little, right from the start, he said, it's not learning in isolation. It's not the teacher abdicating responsibility. But still, that's the misguided conception that many people have kind of thing. So how do we guide learners from a distance? All of this stuff. There's just so many things that advising how we need. And this is happening. There are people offering courses and workshops and all of this on language advising. This is really sort of taken off. But it needs to be a part, I think, of teacher training, teacher education programs in general. And not to mention the technology. And how do we, the technology involved? And also, I think as a part of this is a whole other aspect. I think as a part of teacher education programs, we need courses that prepare people to design innovative learning environments and prepare them to manage those environments. And I'm thinking, of course, of self-access centers, which, self-access centers have taken off. They're all over the world. And now, personally, I'm thinking in terms of social learning spaces as opposed to the traditional self-access center. Mm-hmm. So if people have no idea what learner autonomy is about and their whole conception of education is anywhere from 20 to 200 students in a classroom, and I mean, it still happens today at universities, um, and the teacher at the front with a microphone trying to be heard over the din in the background, then learner autonomy, it's a foreign, it's non-existent, it's
Yeah.
foreign concept. Anyway, but that's just, I think the time has come. And if you think about complexity, for example, like Davis and Samara in their research, they're very clear that they don't use the word autonomy, but the point is they do say if what I took away from this is if autonomy is not present, learning is not going to emerge. For emergence to occur, for the complex phenomena of emergence to occur, there has to be autonomy, self-organization. Okay, so
Yes.
autonomy is important. It's all around us. It's in everything. We need it. We need to wake up and pay attention and start thinking more about it. I think in our programs.
Yeah, I think as you said, people are now waking. This is a wake up call also because, uh, especially I'm talking about Brazil and my experience there, and as a professional who works with distance education, uh, distance learning, uh, people somehow see it with prejudiced eyes, and now they're trying, these same people who have this lots of prejudice have to work with it, so now they're seeing that's hard work. and it's not just everybody needs to be autonomous. This is not autonomy. It needs to have a program, a study behind it. Everybody needs to have guidelines, and it's not a matter of I do it, I do just what I want, and you do just what you want, because sometimes people think like that everybody is free in the learning in the online space, and it's not like that.
Yeah. No, it's these misconceptions. Yeah, autonomy has been greatly misunderstood. So I can see that in online learning too. It's yeah.
Yeah. So since you talked about the self access centers, so you, as I said in your bio, you uh, was responsible for two self access centers in Japan, right?
Right. And okay, so first of all, like my understanding, like a self for those of you who, for those who might be listening who aren't so familiar with the concept of a self access center, and maybe they're out there. In my view, a self access center, and traditionally as it started out, was a facility that housed a lot of materials and equipment, and learners could go there and access that equipment and learn and do self study. Now, the other thing is with self-access centers is that they offer guidance services and learning advising. Learners can, there are people there to work with them, to help them devise a learning plan, to help them give them advice on strategies for how to use different materials effectively, and just talk about their learning, whatever their needs might be. And but what happened was, I think, even before now, to advising has become more or less institutionalized. Like it's everyone accepts it. It's there. It has to be. But so along the way, as this was developing, self-access centers started to offer social activities. For example, I remember visiting a self-access center. I think maybe it was at Macquarie, and somewhere in Australia, the lady was saying that they had set up a buddy system. I was asking them what they had in terms of activities and programs, and one of the things she told me was they had a buddy system. There were conversation groups were common, people getting together to practice their language skills. So gradually, self-access centers started making social events and social activities available. So there was this gradual shift, again, like learner autonomy. It was developing and growing. Now, in my personal case, I started working with self-access learning in 2003. I was hired to work at a university that didn't exist. It was just it was a startup, and it was being created. And about a year before the university opened, the future faculty would gather to hammer out the curriculum. And at one of these meetings, I presented a proposal for a self-access center and a course in self-directed learning, which would be taught in the center. And it caught their imagination. They bought into it. They thought it was a great idea, and especially the president of the university, it caught his imagination. And so, and immediately what they did, they found a space for the self-access center. Now it's important to realize people, self-access centers, we see these brilliant places today, but most people, when they start out very poor. There's no money. They find a room somewhere. It could be a classroom. In this case, the room that I was given was a nice L-shaped room with big windows, so lots of natural light. But basically, it was a storage room. Like when I walked in there for the first time to see this room, my heart sank because it was full of junk. It was full of old furniture covered with dust, clunky stuff that no one would use. Audio-visual equipment. I don't know where they found this stuff. I mean, it looked like people's first attempts at audio-visual. I mean, it was just horrendous. And I thought, what am I going to do with this? I'm one person. What am I going to do? And what happened was, one night after work, all the young guys who worked in administrative offices, they came over and helped me clear out all the junk out of the room. So there was finally a space available. And of course, the president, he made funding available to buy furniture. And the whole idea was for it not to look like a classroom. It was meant to look like an airport lounge kind of thing, without the food and drink, but still, with materials for language learning and computers and stuff like that. So anyway, when the university opened, the self-access center was still not ready because here was me all by myself trying to get materials ready and all of this. So what I did, I asked for student volunteers. And the response was amazing. These kids came, they totally bought into the idea, they made it their own, they worked so hard. And then when the facility did open, there was no one to run it. Like there was no one to sit behind the desk to pass out materials or to see that, to oversee the space when it was open. What they did, they sat down, they worked out a schedule. Basically, they ran the whole thing. So So what we did, we formed like a club, Friends of the Self-Access Center, FOSAC, and I would listen to their ideas. I discussed decisions with them when possible. I implemented their ideas. They ran the place, and then. It became really popular. One of this little anecdote. There was a wall, quite a big wall, all one side that separated the self-access center from a concourse that opened up onto the library. And what the president did, he had that whole wall knocked down and a glass wall put in. It was like being in a goldfish bowl, okay, or being on some sort of reality TV program. Like he was so proud of that center, and whenever he had guests, he wanted to show it to them. So I'd be in there working with kids, doing some advising, helping them with something, and I'd look up, and there would be the president standing with his arms folded and a big smile on his face, surrounded by men in black suits, and and the looks on their faces. I'm sure they had no idea what they were looking at or what they were meant to see, because watching people learn can be like watching paint dry. I mean, So anyway, it became very popular. And this young hotshot, he was very political, very charismatic. He had the president's ear. He came to me one day and he said, I have an idea. I want us to apply for a grant to open up a self-access center in the heart of the city. And it's going to cater to businessmen. And because, as you know, like businessmen in Japan, they have to work long hours of overtime. If the boss says you go here, they go there. And it's very difficult for them to sign up for a regular course. So we were going to help these guys improve their English through the Self-Access Center. Well, lo and behold, we got a huge amount of money from the Ministry of Education, and we opened the center downtown. And there I actually had 3 full-time employees to run the center and keep it going and all of this. And what happened was it became very popular, and we got people from all walks of life. We got business people, some, but we got retired people, housewives. There was a neurological institute on the hill. We got these young doctors who wanted to improve their English. We got students who wanted to pass the entrance exams for the university. So our clientele ranged in age from 17 to 77.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. And so what we were doing, we were offering conversation groups. We had workshops. Sarah Cotterall, she came from New Zealand to join me. And she worked in the center doing language advising and giving workshops and God knows what else. I mean, we worked at the university full time. We were really doing 2 jobs, okay? But it was very rewarding because we were working with the people of the community. We were getting to know them. And one of the things that I noticed was that people were coming for self study. They were coming for the conversation groups, the workshops, or to get language advising. And then afterwards, they were going off for coffee or a drink or lunch. There were these social friendships and social groups were forming. And gradually, it took me a bit of time to realize this, but I finally discovered that one of the main, most significant aspects of the center for these people were the affordances it offered for social interaction. So that's when my whole view shifted from the idea of self-access center to social learning space. And then I moved to Okayama University about 5 years after that. And it was a very exciting time because they were actually creating a social space for language learning. It was going to have language learning materials and that kind of thing, but the focus was on providing a relaxed environment for students to come together and practice their language skills. And so that's when I teamed up with my colleagues Naomi Fujishima and Marika Uzuka, and we began 8 years of research on the social learning space. And yeah,
Wow, that's a wonderful experience. And it shows us that it's not a one man only job, right? It needs uh, partnership and basically support from the administration.
yeah, absolutely. If you don't have the support of the administration, if the administration, if you don't have somebody there, like at Okayama University, surprisingly enough, it was one of the vice presidents who came up with this idea of providing a relaxed environment in which the students could practice their language skills. So, I mean, yeah, you really, it's this whole question of control again.
Yeah.
If the yeah, if particularly in a lot of, I don't know how to say this and make it sound nice, but a lot of Japanese universities are very top down, okay, in terms of control. And perhaps it's the same way with universities all over the world. But in that environment, it's really hard to sell something that isn't going to be a big money maker these days, you know?
Yeah.
And but I think it's very, but at Okayama University I had students tell me, like they have a large number of foreign students, international students, like exchange programs who come to the university, and I've had students tell me that they chose Okayama University because of the social learning space. They chose to come there because they'd heard about it.
Yeah. Let me just tell you a story. I mean, not a happy story as the one you
Not a,
told right now. Yeah, because before working in the university I work right now, I used to work in a high school, federal high school in Brazil. We call it a federal institute because it has high school and also undergrad students. Uh, and then the teachers who worked there, uh, they created a self-access space there, uh, and the students really loved being there because I mean they it was a place that they could learn but also relax and escape from that uh, tiring reality of studying hard. And it was working well, but sadly the administration changed and they wanted the room for another thing. So basically, they destroyed the self-access center and transformed in a storage or another uh, an office basically. So that's why I said it's not a one man only job. You need support from the administration.
Yeah, it takes a community. It's like, it takes a community to raise a village to raise a child. It takes
Yeah.
a community to support a self-access center. And I think, again, like from a complexity perspective, a university is really uh, a conglomerate of all these different systems working together or against each other or whatnot. And I think, you really, yeah, if you don't have people with foresight, see, I've been very fortunate all through my career from the time I started out. I was often working for somebody with vision,
Hmm.
or I had, and or yeah, or they were like this president who wanted this social learning space at Okayama University, for example. So I was very fortunate in that regard. But if you don't have people with vision, and I think that's a real problem in education today. I think they're scarce on the ground, really, you know. And I think another sad thing is that everything in universities today is about administration and accountability and money and so and I know, like in self-access centers, I hear, or in, like at the social learning space at Okayama University, numbers, how many people go each day, how many students are using this. That bothers me because if there are 30 students who really want to learn English or Korean or German or French, and they are going there and connecting with international students from Korea, Germany, and France, and the international students, they have a friend who's introducing them to the Japanese culture, the local culture, helping them with their homework, and that kind of stuff. And the Japanese kid is getting to practice his French language skills and learn about French culture and Korean culture and all of that. You can't put a price on that,
Yeah.
you know? And like, I think that's another thing. It's sort of like the homogenization of education, like this whole idea that everybody needs to be educated to the same degree, so we have to offer these programs. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make, and I've seen this at the university I was working at, they were revising the curriculum and coming out with these new programs. They had far too many required courses because what's happening is the resources are being spread too thin, and kids who really want to learn, they're being forced to sit in classes with kids who couldn't care less. You know, they're just there because it's a required course. They need to get the credit. I want my credit. I want to move on. And so I think there's a lot of stuff we need to really stop and think about seriously.
Yeah.
What are we trying to do here? You know?
Yeah, but I mean, you gave us uh, very good ideas, and it was a very. I mean, I'm thinking here now. What can I do to open a social learning space in my university? So, yeah, I think it was an inspiring answer to my question. Uh, so, uh, you talked before about practices. I mean, things we can do in order to foster learners' autonomy. So
Right.
based on your experience, uh, what would you say is effective or ineffective to foster learners' autonomy?
Okay, I'm looking for my notes here because I actually jotted down some ideas for that
Mm-hmm.
question. And what I did, I jotted down some keywords, okay? Like I don't have perhaps anything new to say, and I don't have, any great, magic pill or anything like that. But the first word that came to my mind that I wrote down was trust. And we talked earlier about, I came up through this system where the teacher had to control the classroom. So for the early years, when I was instituting, like in my classroom, like I didn't have a self-access center, but I sort of did in my classroom, because what we did, we had a reading corner, we had a corner with tape recorders, so kids could. This was a long time ago, so kids could listen to recorded books and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
They had they could watch movies. There was computers. They could watch DVDs or or no, in those days it might have been even VHS. It was a while ago. Anyway, but in the classroom, so these things were happening. Okay, and one of my big fears was letting go of control. So I think, teachers, we have to come to terms with that. Like we have to trust in students, and we have to trust in the environments, the learning environments that we create, that these environments will carry the students. And that's why I think it's important to have the kind of relationship where you work with the students, where students have a chance to talk about their learning. Okay? And that was another point I was going to make further on, but I'll come back to that point about talking about learning. But the next word that I had written down, keyword, was experience. Students, learners need to experience autonomy. And if they don't have an opportunity, if they're not in an environment and don't have activities which enable them to exercise their autonomy, how can they become autonomous? So they need to be able to experience autonomy. And another thing, coming back, I mentioned talking about learning, this whole idea of reflection. You know, we don't ask learners to to reflect on their learning, or not enough. Like, we expect, if we go to the doctor, we like to think that the doctor is thinking about his work, okay? If we're driving, if we get on a bus downtown, we like to think that that bus driver is thinking about his work. Well, we want our students to be thinking about their work too, and their work is learning. And so I believe that it's impossible to build enough opportunities for reflection into a curriculum or a lesson plan or whatever. We need to give them as many possibilities as possible to talk about their learning. And I mean, at first it seems like talk about learning, like cognitive stuff, metacognitive stuff, that's a bit much. But no, like I tell my kids very simply, think about, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Is it working? How do I know it's not working? What can I do differently? How can I make this work for me? These very simple day-to-day questions. And the next point is sharing. Sometimes you don't know you have an idea until you start to talk about it with somebody else. When you start to put that idea or what you're thinking or feeling into words, you sort of formulate it, okay? So I think it's very important for students to have an opportunity to get together. Like at one point in pedagogy, they were talking about debriefing activities, that kind of thing. And, I think that's very, very important for students to have these opportunities. And the other thing is, the next point that I mentioned is strategy instruction. Teachers need to provide students with strategies. They need to show them how to, how to use materials, activities they can do on their own, that kind of thing. And of course, finally, I like the idea of space. Like we need alternative spaces. Like these classrooms, I've sat in so many classrooms with cement brick walls, painted over cement brick walls and slits for windows. I mean, these don't inspire the imagination. They don't, and I'm sure they don't inspire a love of learning. Like mostly kids can't wait to get out of there, kind of thing, So anyway, so I don't know. As I said, I've no magic pill, but I think these are some of the things that we can do to promote autonomy in our classrooms.
Yeah, and while I was listening to your answer, I was thinking about connectivism, which four main characteristics are autonomy, connectedness, diversity, and openness. So I think it's pretty much related to what you said. I mean, you need an open environment so autonomy can emerge. But openness does not mean that everybody is separated, but interrelated and interacting. Uh,
And openness is a key of complex dynamic systems. They have to be open, like and diversity, like we feed off each other. So, and I mean, feed might not be a very positive word, but we support each other. Like yeah, yeah, we and we live off each other's energy as well. Like this interaction, this openness, very, very important, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't understand people. I don't understand why, like autonomy. There's all the and like in terms of motivation, DC and Ryan, like one of their key pillars is autonomy. But still, in spite of all of this, autonomy seems to be misunderstood and um, seems to get a bad, sort of a negative rap in language learning, really, to a degree. I think it's not well understood.
Yeah. What I like, what I enjoyed about our conversation here is that we covered all the topics, but not in a linear order. But we covered all of them, so I think it was very nice. So before concluding, I want to hear your thoughts uh, on the situation that we're living now. Uh, what advice would you give to teacher educators and teachers, and also to learners?
Well, I think I've sort of covered this in a way. I mean, right
Yeah.
now, at this particular point in time, uh, there's not a lot we can do except catch where catch can't. We just, the best we can do now is make the best of a very bad situation. Okay. But I think there are a lot of lessons that can be gleaned from this. And I think perhaps I saw a Japanese teacher the other day. Like she's been connecting with her students at home. This was on NHK and the Japanese public broadcasting, and she was saying the lesson that she took from all of this is that students need to be in the classroom. Okay, but so she sort of, and so I, as a listener, I thought, okay, well, she's just missing this whole idea of online learning and whatnot. Personally, I think it's very important not to throw the baby out with the bath. Like I think online learning, um, I think it's a good thing, and I think there's no reason why students can't be at a distance, okay, and
Mhm.
still be learning, kind of thing. But I think the teacher made a good point in that um, one of the possible outcomes of this current situation is that administrators will see an opportunity to make money or to save money. If they can do online learning, then they can cut down on classrooms, on cost,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Okay, and they can see all kinds of possibilities. But the point is, people are people, and at some point, people need to come together. And I think that universities and schools, we need to rethink the classroom environment, and we need innovative facilities, spaces where learners can come together and can learn, but not in the traditional classroom mode kind of thing. So I don't know. But certainly, and I think for learners, one of the things that's going to happen, I think learners need to think about what it is they, in terms of language learning, I'm talking. If they, is it important for them to learn a language? Can they imagine a future in which they would be using a foreign language? And at this point in time, it's probably very difficult to imagine a future because the future is so uncertain. But maybe that's exactly why we need to do that. Why we need to get students thinking about what will their future hold for them in terms of foreign language. And then if they are serious about learning a foreign language, then they need to understand that they need to take on responsibility for themselves, that they just can't expect to take a few classes from a teacher and learn the language. And from the teacher perspective, they need to understand that they have two jobs. uh, well, they've always had many jobs, but
Yeah.
not only to teach the language, but to help learners learn how to learn the language. Okay, so the two things sort of have to go, and that comes back to what I was saying about strategy instruction, about how to, ideas for using materials, and of course the internet today. I mean, everything you need to learn a language is basically available on the internet. And you might say, well, how could I learn to speak? Well, you know, they're just look what we're doing.
Yeah.
It's there are just many, many possibilities. And, and with all these interactive programs and, gamers, like I've had the good fortune of having gamers in my classroom, and these kids were practically bilingual when they came into the classroom. Why? Because they were a part of this international gaming community. So there's
Yeah.
lots of potential there.
It happened to
So
me
I don't,
also.
yeah. Oh, wow. So you're a gamer?
No, no, no. To my, I had students who were gamers, and also students who were like fans of Harry Potter, for example. So they were uh, immersed in this Harry Potter world and community. So because they had to interact with people from all over the world to talk about the books, they ended up learning. So it was also a good experience for me.
And a community of practice
Yeah.
for all these kids. Yeah. The same with the gaming. It's communities of practice, really. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would really like to thank you so much for believing in this idea and accepting to participate right away. It's an honor to me to be here interacting with you, and I'm sure everybody who is watching had the same feeling. And I look forward to interacting more with you, and I'm sure we can uh, come up with other ideas too. And so, thank you very much for your participation here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored to have been invited and to be included in your cast of academics. It's been an honor and a privilege, and it's nice to get to know you better. So thank you very much.
So, thank you, everybody who's here watching. So, we see you on the next interview. So, bye, Dr. Garold Murray.
Bye.